Hello guys, and welcome back to my channel. So our main theme of stories today is about the Second World War. But before I begin our stories today, I want to tell you guys that our channel is completely new and need a lot of support from your subscribers. Please hit the subscribe button and leave the comment below to suggest our new contents. And actually, today is like more than a week that I started this channel. Please support us. So this is the stories. There's a streak of stories about the Second World War. So that's why I should begin it right now and tell the stories to you guys. Please lie down on your bed and set yourself comfy, and then we could start the story right away. Chapter 1 is also the introduction. What is a world war? When we hear the words world war, we might picture tanks rolling across muddy fields, planes dropping bombs over cities, or soldiers marching into the unknown. But have you ever stopped to ask, why is it called a world war? What makes it different from other wars in history? A world war is not just a conflict between two countries. It's not simply about how many soldiers fought or how many years it lasted. A world war means something far bigger. It's a moment when dozens of nations across continents are pulled into violence that affects every part of life, from economy, politics, families, and futures. It's when war reaches your doorstep, whether you are in Europe, Asia, Africa, or America. In the 20th century, the world didn't just fight once, it fought twice. The First World War shook the foundation of old empires, but just 2 decades later, the world returned to chaos with even more deadly force in the Second World War. This Second War involved more than 70 countries and led to over 70 million deaths. No one was untouched, not soldiers, not civilians, not even children. But behind every battle, every map, every statistic, there are people, real people, students who stopped going to school, artists who had to paint for propaganda, mothers who sent their sons to war and waited forever. These are the voices we often forget, and they deserve to be heard. In this series, we'll explore the events of the Second World War not as distant facts but as living stories. We'll ask, why did the world go to war again? Who made the decisions? And what could have changed? And most importantly, what can we learn from it today? This is not just a history lesson. This is a journey into the heart of humanity through its darkest moments and toward the hope of peace. Let's begin. Chapter 2. The World After the First World War. The First World War was supposed to be the war to end all wars, but instead of bringing lasting peace, it left behind a broken, angry world. By the time it ended in 1918, over 16 million people had died, entire empire had collapsed, and millions more were struggling with poverty, grief, and trauma. Europe was exhausted, physically, economically, and emotionally. One of the biggest consequences of the war was the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919. It blamed Germany entirely for the war and imposed harsh punishments, massive war reparations, loss of territory, and strict limits on its military. Many Germans saw this treaty as unfair, even humiliating. It planted seeds of resentment that would grow in the years to come. At the same time, the world was changing rapidly. Old empires like Austria, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire disappeared. New countries like Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Yugoslavia appeared, but borders were drawn by powerful nations, often without asking the people who lived there. This created ethnic tension and political instability in many regions. Meanwhile, economic problems were spreading. The 1920s brought hope, but also fragile economies, especially in Germany. Then came depression in 1929, and everything collapsed. Unemployment soared, banks failed, people lost their savings, their homes, and their faith in democracy. In this chaos, new voices began to rise, voices that promised strength, order, and national pride. Some of these voices belong to dangerous ideologies: fascism, militarism, and racism. In Italy, Mussolini took power. In Japan, the army grew stronger. And in Germany, a man named Adolf Hitler was watching, waiting, and preparing for his move. The world had ended one war, but without solving the reasons it began. And by ignoring the warning signs of the 1930s, humanity was unknowingly marching toward even greater disaster. Chapter 3. Why did Hitler rise to power? After the First World War, Germany was broken, economically, politically, and emotionally. The Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to accept blame for the war and pay huge reparations. The economy collapsed. Money became worthless. People stood in long lines for food. Millions felt humiliated, angry, and abandoned by their government. In this crisis, Adolf Hitler began to speak, loud, confident, and full of blame. He said Germany had been betrayed, not defeated. He blamed the Allies, the Communists, the Jews, anyone but Germans themselves. And he promised strength, order, and national pride. Hitler joined the Nazi Party, a small radical group with fiery speeches, propaganda, and violent street supporters. The Nazis gained attention fast. They offered simple answers to complex problems, and many people, desperate and afraid, most of them listened. In 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Soon after, he used a fire at the German Parliament as an excuse to grab emergency powers. He banned other political parties, silenced critics, and turned democracy into dictatorship. Schools taught children to worship him. Books were burned. Jews and political opponents were slowly erased from public life. Fear ruled, and while some supported him, most stayed silent. Outside Germany, the world saw that happening but didn't act. Still afraid of another war, other nations looked away. The silence gave Hitler exactly what he needed: time and power, and the opportunity to lead the world into another, even worse, the Second World War. Chapter 4. Fascism around the world. When people hear fascism, they often think of Hitler's Germany, but between the two World Wars, fascist ideas were spreading across the globe, especially in countries facing crisis. In Italy, Benito Mussolini brought fascism to power in 1922. He promised to make Italy strong again, banned political opposition, and ruled with violence and propaganda. He called himself the Second Deuce. It means the leader. In Spain, Francisco Franco led a brutal civil war and became a dictator in 1939. His regime controlled the media, banned opposition, and feared communism, much like Hitler's. In Japan, the military gained power behind the emperor. They believed Japan had a mission to dominate Asia. They invaded Manchuria in 1931, then China in 1937, leading to atrocities like the Nanjing Massacre. Even in democracies like Britain, France, and the US, small fascist groups appeared. Most failed, but they showed how fear, anger, and economic crisis made people turn to extreme ideas. So, why did fascism grow? Because it offered simple answers, strong leaders, and national pride, while taking away freedom and truth. By the late 1930s, Germany, Italy, and Japan, three fascist powers, were ready to form a deadly alliance, and the world was heading toward a Second World War. Chapter 5. Why did Japan invade Asia? In the 1930s, Japan was growing fast, but it didn't have enough natural resources. It lacked oil, coal, iron, and land for farming. Leaders in Tokyo believed Japan deserved more, and they looked to Asia. But this wasn't just about resources. Japan's leaders believed they were superior to other Asian countries. They saw Western powers like Britain and US controlling colonies across Asia, so they asked, why not Japan? In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, a region in northern China, rich in coal and land. They created a puppet state called Manchukuo. The world protested, but no one stopped them. Encouraged, Japan continued expanding. By 1937, Japan launched a full invasion of China. It wasn't just a war, it was brutal. Cities were bombed, civilians were killed. In Nanjing, Japanese troops murdered over 200,000 people and committed horrific crimes. It shocked the world, but again, few acted. So why did Japan keep going? Because it worked. They gained territory, they gained power, and no one stood in their way. Inside Japan, propaganda told people this was a mission to liberate Asia from Western control, to build Greater East Asia, called Prosperity Sphere, a fancy name for empire. But in reality, Japan was replacing Western rule with its own, and as Japan expanded through Korea, Taiwan, and Southeast Asia, it set the stage for a bigger clash with China, the US, and eventually the entire world. Chapter 6. How did the Second World War begin? After years of rising tension, war finally broke out in 1939, but it didn't start with a global explosion. It began with one bold move. On the 1st September 1999, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. German tanks and planes moved quickly in a strategy called Blitzkrieg. It means lightning war. It was fast, brutal, and overwhelming. Within weeks, Polish cities fell, and the country was divided between Germany and the Soviet Union, who had secretly agreed to split Poland in a deal called the Molotov-Ribbentrop. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. They had promised to protect Poland, and now they had to act. The Second World War had officially begun. But here's something important. Even though war was declared, there wasn't much fighting in the West right away. This period, called the Phony War, lasted for several months. People waited, armies prepared, but nothing big happened. Yet, behind the scenes, Hitler wasn't slowing down. He quickly turned west, taking over Denmark and Norway in April 1940. Then came the big strike. Germany invaded France, Belgium, and Netherlands and Luxembourg in May. Using Blitzkrieg again, German forces moved fast, and by June 1940, France surrendered. Suddenly, only Britain was left standing in Western Europe. It was now Germany's main enemy and the next target. Meanwhile, in the East, Japan was already at war with China and preparing to challenge the other Asian powers. So, while it started in Poland, the Second World War quickly became a global war involving Europe, Asia, Africa, and soon the United States. The spark had been lit, and now the world was on fire. Chapter 7. The Fall of France. After declaring war on Germany in 1939, France and Britain expected a long fight. But for months, little happened. It was called the Phony War. In May 1940, Germans suddenly attacked the West, invading Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. Instead of going through strong French defenses, German tanks surprised everyone by pushing through the Ardennes forest, a place the French thought was safe. German forces moved fast. Allied troops were surrounded by near Dunkirk, but in a dramatic rescue, over 300,000 soldiers escaped to Britain. The miracle of Dunkirk. By June, German troops entered Paris. France surrendered. Just weeks later, it was shocking. A powerful nation defeated. In only 6 weeks, Germany split France into two. The north was occupied. The south became Vichy France, a Nazi-aligned puppet state. But resistance didn't die. Charles de Gaulle, from exile in London, called on the French to keep fighting. Now, Hitler controlled most of Western Europe. Only Britain remained alone, but not defeated. Chapter 8. Britain stands alone. By mid-1940, Hitler had conquered most of Western Europe. Poland had fallen. France had surrendered. The Low Countries were occupied. Only Britain remained. But Hitler had a plan, Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. Before landing troops, he needed to destroy Britain's air force. That began the Battle of Britain, the first major air battle in history. Starting in July 1940, the German Luftwaffe launched waves of attack. At first, they targeted military bases and radar stations, but soon German bombers began hitting cities, especially London. This bombing campaign became known as the Blitz. Night after night, bombs fell, fires burned, thousands died, but Britain refused to surrender. British pilots, especially the young ones of the Royal Air Force (RAF), fought bravely. They were outnumbered but had greater strong coordination and determination. As Prime Minister Winston Churchill said, never in the field of human conflict was so much owned by so many to so few. By October, Hitler gave up on invading Britain, his first major defeat. But the bombing didn't stop. The Blitz continued for months. Ordinary people slept in subway tunnels, dug shelter, and carried on with life, showing incredible resilience. Britain stood alone, but it didn't fall, and slowly help was coming from across the Atlantic. The United States was watching and preparing. Chapter 9. Pearl Harbor. By late 1940, the world was already at war, but the United States had not yet joined. America sent supplies to Britain and China, but stayed officially neutral. Many Americans didn't want to fight another world war, but tensions with Japan were rising. The US had placed economic sanctions on Japan, especially cutting off oil. Japan saw this as a threat and decided to strike first. On the first morning of 7th of December 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Just before 8 a.m., hundreds of Japanese planes appeared in the sky. They bombed ships, airfields, and fuel tanks. In less than 2 hours, the U.S. Pacific Fleet was badly damaged. 8 battleships hit, over 180 aircrafts destroyed, more than 2,400 Americans killed. The attack was meant to cripple the U.S. Navy, giving Japan time to conquer more territory in Asia and the Pacific. But it had the opposite effect. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt called it a date which will live in infamy. On December 8, the United States declared war on Japan. A few days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the US, and America responded. The war was now truly global, and the world's most powerful economy had entered the fight. Chapter 10. The Axis Advances. In early 1942, the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, were at their strongest. They had conquered much of Europe, North Africa, and Asia. It seemed like nothing could stop them. In Europe, Germany controlled Poland, France, and Low Countries, and parts of the Balkans. In North Africa, German General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, pushed British forces back toward Egypt. Italy had also invaded parts of Africa, though with less success. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, Hitler prepared to attack his former ally, the Soviet Union, but that invasion, Operation Barbarossa, would come soon and cost him dearly. In the Pacific, Japan moved fast. After Pearl Harbor, they captured Hong Kong, the Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies, gaining vital oil, rubber, and resources. British and American forces were retreating. In just months, Japan built an empire stretching from Korea to Indonesia. Everywhere, the Allies were on defense, and the Axis seemed unstoppable. But cracks were starting to show. The invasion of the Soviet Union would stretch enemy thin. Japan's rapid expansion woke a sleeping giant, the United States, and the Allied nations began to organize, unify, and fight back. For now, the Axis was advancing, but change was coming. Chapter 11: Operation Barbarossa. In the summer of 1941, Hitler made a bold and risky move. Despite signing a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union in 1939, he now chose to break it. His goal: destroy communism, seize land, and defeat Stalin. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in history. Over 3 million German and Axis soldiers, backed by thousands of tanks and aircraft, stormed into Soviet territory. The Soviets were caught off guard. In the early weeks, German forces advanced rapidly, capturing vast lands, destroying Soviet divisions, and taking hundreds of thousands of prisoners. By autumn, the Germans had reached the outskirts, Leningrad, Moscow, and Ukraine. It looked like the Soviet Union might collapse, but then the tide began to turn. The Soviet winter hit early and brutally. German troops, poorly prepared for freezing temperatures, suffered from cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Soviet resistance stiffened. New troops arrived. Factories were moved east beyond German reach and began producing weapons non-stop. In December 1941, the Soviets launched a counter-offensive near Moscow, pushing the Germans back. What began as a lightning fast invasion had turned into a grinding, frozen nightmare. Operation Barbarossa became the start of a long and bloody war on the Eastern Front, a front that would claim tens of millions of lives. Chapter 12: The Holocaust begins. While the Second World War raged on, another war, more silent, more horrifying, was taking place behind the front lines. This was the Holocaust, the systematic genocide of 6 million Jews, along with millions of others: Roma people, disabled individuals, Slavs, political opponents, and others the Nazis considered unworthy of life. Even before the war, Hitler had blamed Jews for Germany's problems. Anti-Semitic laws stripped Jews of rights, jobs, and property. After the war began, things escalated. In 1941, as Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Mobile killing units called Einsatzgruppen flowed the army. They rounded up Jewish men, women, and children, and shot them by the thousands in forests and fields. But this was only the beginning. The Nazis planned something bigger, a total solution. In January 1942, top Nazi officials met at Wannsee Conference. They organized the final solution to the Jewish question, the plan to exterminate all Jews in Europe. Jews were deported from across the continent to death camps in Eastern Europe, the most infamous being Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor. In these camps, people were murdered in gas chambers, starved, and forced into hard labor. Children, the elderly, entire families gone in days. Some Jews resisted. Some Jews escaped. Some were hidden by brave non-Jews. But most were not so lucky. By the end of the war, 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population had been killed. The Holocaust was not just a crime of war, it was a crime against humanity, a reminder of what hatred, silence, and obedience can lead to. Chapter 13: Resistance and Rebellion. Even in the darkest days of the Second World War, many people chose not to stay silent. Across occupied Europe, brave men and women resisted the Nazis, risking their lives to fight for freedom. These underground groups were known as the Resistance. In France, resistance fighters sabotaged railways, attacked German paid patrols, and passed secret messages. They helped downed Allied pilots escape and spied for the British. In Poland, the Home Army organized uprisings and built secret schools and newspapers. The most famous rebellion came later, the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, where Polish fighters held off the Nazis for weeks, even though they were outgunned and alone. In the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Greece, and beyond, people hid Jews, spread underground newspapers, and fought back in small but powerful ways. Even in Germany, a few brave individuals resisted. The White Rose Group, led by students, distributed anti-Nazi leaflets. Some German officers tried to assassinate Hitler, most famously in the failed July 20 plot of 1944. Resistance looked different in each country. Some used weapons, others used words, hiding places, or silence. But all shared one thing: courage. These people knew the risks, arrest, torture, and even death. But they fought anyway. Their efforts reminded the world that not everyone gave in to hate. Even when surrounded by fear, many chose to stand up. Chapter 14: The War in North Africa. While Europe burned and a different kind of war was unfolding in the sands of North Africa. Here, tanks clashed in the desert, supply lines stretched for miles, and control of the Suez Canal, a key trade route, was at stake. It all began in 1940, when Italy, an Axis power, invaded British-controlled Egypt from Libya. But the Italians struggled, and soon Germany sent help. The Africa Corps, led by General Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox. Rommel was clever, daring, and fast. He pushed British forces east toward Egypt, capturing territory quickly, but supply lines across the desert were long and vulnerable. The British regrouped, led by General Bernard Montgomery. In October 1942, the two sides met at the Second Battle of El Alamein. This was a turning point. The British launched a powerful attack. Rommel's forces, low on supplies, were pushed back westward. Meanwhile, U.S. forces landed in Morocco and Algeria during Operation Torch. Now, the Axis was trapped between the British in the east and the Americans in the west. By May 1943, Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. Over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers were taken prisoner. The victory gave the Allies control of North Africa and a launch point for the next target, Italy. Chapter 15. Italy falls. After winning in North Africa, the Allies set their sights on Italy, the soft underbelly of Europe, as Churchill called it. In July 1943, American and British forces landed on the island of Sicily. They fought against German and Italian troops pushed north. The invasion was fierce, but the Allies advanced steadily. Back in Italy, the people were growing tired of war and of Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator who had allied with Hitler. As the Allies moved through Sicily, Mussolini was arrested by his own government. Italy's new leaders tried to switch sides and secretly negotiate peace with the Allies. But Hitler didn't let Italy go easily. German troops rushed in and occupied northern and central Italy. They rescued Mussolini and put him in charge of Nazi-backed puppet state in the north, the Italian Social Republic. Meanwhile, the Allies landed Italy and began a slow, bloody advance northward. The fighting was brutal. The mountainous terrain favored the defenders. German forces made strong stands, especially in Monte Cassino, where battles raged for months. Finally, in June 1944, Allied forces liberated Rome. The fall of Italy was not quick or easy, but it removed one Axis power from the war and forced Germany to stretch its forces even further. Chapter 16. D-Day, the invasion of Normandy. By 1944, the Allies were ready to take back Western Europe. They had fought in North Africa and Italy. Now they aimed for France, still under Nazi occupation. This would be the largest seaborne invasion in history. Its codename Operation Overlord. The day it began became known as D-Day, June 6, 1944. Before the landing, the Allies planned carefully. They built fake armies to confuse the Germans. Paratroopers were dropped behind enemy lines at night. Warships bombarded the coast. Then, at dawn, over 156 troops from the United States, Britain, Canada, and other nations stormed the beaches of Normandy in northern France. The bridges had codenames Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Some landings faced little resistance. Others, like Omaha Beach, were hell on earth, filled with mines, machine guns, and heavy fire. Many soldiers never made it off the sand, but by the nightfalls, the Allies had rescued the beachheads. Within weeks, hundreds of thousands more troops poured into France. The Germans fought back fiercely, but slowly the Allies pushed inland, liberating towns, railroads, and roads. But by August 1944, they had liberated Paris. D-Day was the turning point in Western Europe. It marked the beginning of the end of the Nazi Germany. Chapter 17. The Liberation of France. After the successful D-Day landings in June 1944, the Allies began the hard task of liberating France, step by step, village by village. German forces were entrenched, well-armed and determined to hold their grounds. The hedge roads of Normandy turned into deadly traps, narrow roads, hidden snipers, and brutal ambushes. But the Allies advanced slowly and steadily. American, British, and Canadian troops worked together. French resistance fighters rose up, sabotaging German supply lines and providing key intelligence. In July 1944, the Allies launched Operation Cobra, breaking through the German lines in Normandy. The momentum shifted. By August, Allied forces raced across northern France. German troops were retreating fast and disorganized. On August 25, 1944, the Free French forces, led by General Charles de Gaulle, entered Paris. Crowds cheered, flags waved. After 4 years under Nazi rule, Paris was free, but the fight wasn't over. Southern France was also invaded by Operation Dragon, with more Allied troops pushing north. German units regrouped, but they couldn't stop the tide. By September, most of France was liberated. The Allies now turned toward Germany itself. The liberation of France was a major turning point. It showed the world that the Nazi Empire could be broken, and that freedom was returning to Europe. Chapter 18. The Soviet pushed west while the Allies liberated France in the west. Another storm was rising in the east. Since the Battle of Stalingrad in early 1943, the Soviet Red Army had been on the offensive, pushing the Germans back mile by mile. In 1944, the Soviets launched Operation Bagration, one of the largest offensives in history. It crushed German army groups central and drove deep into Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltic states, and eventually Poland. The battles were massive. Millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, and heavy artillery. The fighting was brutal. Cities were reduced to rubble. Villages disappeared. Casualties were enormous on both sides. As the Soviets advanced, they also liberated concentration camps, uncovering the horrors of the Holocaust. In August 1944, the Warsaw Uprising began. Polish resistance fighters rose up against the Nazis, hoping for Soviet support. But the Red Army stopped just across the river and didn't intervene. The uprising was crushed and Warsaw was nearly destroyed. Still, the Soviet advance continued. By early 1945, the Red Army had reached the Oder River, less than 70 kilometers from Berlin. Germany was now being squeezed by the Americans and British from the west, and by the Soviets from the east. The final battle was coming. Chapter 19. The Fall of Berlin. By April 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing. From the west, American, British, and French troops had crossed the Rhine River. From the east, the Soviet Red Army was advancing, fast and relentless. At the center stood Berlin, the capital of the Third Reich, now surrounded. Inside the city, chaos ruled. Civilians hid in basements. Soldiers, young boys and old men prepared for a final defense. Adolf Hitler, isolated in his underground Führer bunker, still hoped for a miracle. By April 16, 1945, the Battle of Berlin began. The Soviets attacked from outside, bombarding the city with artillery and street-by-street combat. It was brutal, destructive, and terrifying. As Soviet troops closed in, Hitler realized the end was near. On April 30th, he and his wife, Eva Braun, committed suicide in the bunker. His body was burned by loyal aides. Within days, many Nazi leaders either surrendered or took their own lives. On May 2nd, Berlin officially fell to Soviet forces, and on May 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allies. The next day, May 8, 1945, became known as WWII Day, Victory in Europe Day. The war in Europe was over, but the world was not yet at peace because in the Pacific, the war with Japan still raged on. Chapter 20: The Pacific War. While Europe celebrated the end of war in May 1945, the battle in the Pacific still raged on. Since the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States and Japan had been locked in a fierce struggle across the vast Pacific Ocean. At first, Japan had the upper hand, capturing the Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, and much of Southeast Asia. But by 1942, the tide began to turn. In June 1942, the U.S. won a crucial victory at the Battle of Midway, sinking 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. From then on, America slowly pushed westward in a strategy called island hopping, capturing key islands one by one, getting closer to Japan. Battles like Guadalcanal, Saipan, and Palaleo were brutal. Japanese soldiers often refused to surrender, fighting to the death, to their last breath. Many civilians were caught in the crossfire or forced to commit suicide under fear of American invasion. In early 1945, U.S. forces captured Iwo Jima and Okinawa, 2 islands close to Japan itself. The cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of lives lost on both sides as the Allies planned a possible invasion of the Japanese mainland. Fears grew. It was clear if Japan didn't surrender, the final battle could be even worse than Berlin. Chapter 21: Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Atomic Shadow. By the summer of 1945, Japan was on the verge of defeat, but still refused to surrender. American leaders feared that invading Japan's home islands would cost millions of lives, both Allied and Japanese. So they turned to a new weapon, one born from the secret Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb. On August 6, 1945, a U.S. bomber named Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb, Little Boy, over the city of Hiroshima. In seconds, the city was engulfed in a blinding flash. Buildings vanished, Tens of thousands died instantly. Tens of thousands more would die in the following weeks from burns, radiation, and injuries. Still, Japan did not surrender. 3 days later, on August 9th, the US dropped a second bomb, Fat Man, over Nagasaki. The destruction was again unimaginable. The human suffering immense. In August 15, 1945, Japan finally announced its surrender. The war was over, but the use of atomic bombs left deep scars, not just on cities and people, but on the conscience of the world. Chapter 22. Japan surrenders and the war ends. After the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese government faced a grim reality: total destruction or surrender. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation by radio, the first time his voice had ever been heard by ordinary citizens. He announced Japan's unconditional surrender. The world was stunned. For the first time in history, both Germany and Japan, the Axis powers, had fallen. On the 2nd September 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japanese officials signed the official surrender document in front of representatives of the United States, Britain, and Soviet Union, China, and others. The ceremony was brief, solemn, and historic. The Second World War was over, but the world it left behind was forever changed. Over 60 million people had died: soldiers, civilians, victims of genocide, famine, and bombings. Cities were reduced to rubble. Empires collapsed. New powers emerged. The war ended, but the consequences had just begun. Europe was divided, East versus West. The United Nations was born, and a new rivalry would soon rise: the Cold War. Chapter 23. Aftermath is a divided world. The Second World War had ended, but peace was fragile. Across Europe and Asia, cities lay in ruins. Millions were homeless, hungry, and traumatized. Entire countries had to be rebuilt, not just their buildings, but their governments, economies, and societies. In the West, the United States launched the Marshall Plan, billions of dollars in aid to help rebuild Western Europe and prevent the spread of communism. Meanwhile, in the East, the Soviet Union expanded its influence. It occupied much of Eastern Europe, installing communist governments loyal to Moscow. A new kind of conflict was emerging, not with bombs and tanks, but with ideologies and nuclear threats. The world was dividing into two camps: the Western Bloc, led by the United States; the Eastern Bloc, led by the Soviet Union. It was the beginning of the Cold War, a global standoff that would last for decades. In 1949, two major events reshaped the world. NATO was formed, and military alliances of Western nations. The Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb. From the ashes of the Second World War, a new and dangerous era had begun. Chapter 24. The birth of the United Nations. The devastation of the Second World War left the world determined to prevent such tragedy from ever happening again. During the war, Allied leaders had already begun imagining a new global organization, one that could maintain peace, promote human rights, and support rebuilding efforts. On October 24, 1945, just weeks after Japan's surrender, the United Nations was officially founded. Its charter had been signed months earlier by 50 nations in San Francisco, including the US, Soviet Union, China, Britain, and France. The UN was built on the ashes of the failed League of Nations, but this time the world powers agreed to join and lead it. The organization had several goals: prevent future wars through diplomacy and dialogue, provide humanitarian aid to war-torn regions, protect human rights and promote social progress, support decolonization and global cooperation. A new international court and peacekeeping forces were created. Agencies like UNICEF, UNESCO, and the World Health Organization soon followed. Though not perfect, the UN became a symbol of hope in a divided world. In the aftermath of war, it was a sign that nations could come together, not to destroy, but to rebuild. Chapter 25. The Nuremberg Trials. Justice after war. When the Second World War ended, the world faced a new question. How should those responsible for the horrors of the war be held accountable? For the first time in history, the victorious nations decided to put leaders of a defeated regime on trial, not just for waging war, but for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. The trials took place in the German city of Nuremberg, beginning in November 1945. 24 top Nazi officers were brought before an international military tribunal. They included Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and other close associates of Hitler. They were charged with planning a starting aggressive war, committing atrocities against civilians and prisoners, organizing the Holocaust. For the world, it was shocking. Not just the crimes, but the evidence, films, photos, documents, survivor testimonies. The trials were opened to the public, and the press from around the world covered them. These were justice, but also a message. Even in war, there are rules, and those who break them must be judged. By October 1946, the verdicts were delivered. 12 sentenced to death, others to long prison terms. A few were acquitted, sparking debate that still continues today. The Nuremberg trials led to the foundation of modern international law. They asked the world to confront evil, not with revenge, but with truth and law. Chapter 26. The Division of Germany. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, the country lay in ruins, physically, politically, and morally. The Allies had agreed to divide Germany into 4 occupation zones, each controlled by the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. The capital, Berlin, was also divided the same way, even though it lay deep inside the Soviet zone. At first, the plan was temporary, a way to stabilize the country and prevent a Nazi resurgence. But soon, the cracks appeared. The Western Allies wanted to rebuild Germany with democracy and capitalism. The Soviet Union had other plans, turn it into a communist state, aligning with Moscow ideology. In 1949, the split became official. The Federal Republic of Germany, also known as West Germany, was formed by the US and European support. In response, the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, was created under Soviet control. Berlin, though entirely inside East Germany, was still divided into West and East sectors. It became a tense symbol of the Cold War. Families were split, freedom of movement ended, and in time, a war would rise. But that's a story for later. Germany, once the heart of war, was now the front line of a new global conflict. Chapter 27. The Berlin elite, a city under siege. By 1948, tensions between Western allies and the Soviet Union had reached a boiling point. In that year, the Western allies introduced a new currency in their zones of Germany, the Dutch mark, to help economic recovery. The Soviet Union saw this as a threat and a step toward a unified West Germany. In response, on June 24, 1948, the Soviets blocked all land and rail access to West Berlin, hoping to force the Allies to abandon the city. Over 2 million people in West Berlin were now trapped, surrounded by Soviet territory, but cut off from food, coal, and medical supplies. But the Allies didn't give in. Instead, they launched an ambitious operation, a massive airlift to supply the city entirely by air. Day and night, American and British planes flew over a blockade, landing every few minutes. They brought in food, fuel, medicine, over 200,000 flights in less than a year. Children called them ricin bombers, as pilots dropped candy along with food parcels. Despite bad weather, mechanical failures, and Soviet pressure, the airlift worked. On May 12, 1949, the Soviets lifted the blockade. Western Berlin had survived. The Berlin airlift became a powerful symbol of Western resolve and deepened the divide between East and West. 28. The rise of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. In the wake of the Second World War, fear and mistrust dominated international relations. The Western Allies no longer saw the Soviet Union as a partner, but as a potential threat. And after the Berlin blockade, 1948 to 1949, the need for collective defense became urgent. On April 4, 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO, was created. 12 countries, including the United States, United Kingdom, France, Canada, and several Western European nations, signed the treaty. Their promise, an attack on one would be considered an attack on all. NATO wasn't just a military alliance, it was a political message. The West would stand together against aggression. Meanwhile, in the East, the Soviet Union responded. In 1955, after West Germany joined NATO, the USSR formed its own alliance, the Warsaw Pact, including Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and other Eastern Bloc nations. Now, Europe was firmly divided. NATO in the West, Warsaw Pact in the East. Each side pointed nuclear weapons at each other. Each side built up massive armies. Each side feared the other's next move. Though the Second World War was over, the world had entered a new kind of war, cold, silent, and dangerously armed. Chapter 29. The Arms Race and the Nuclear Standoff. After the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world changed forever. The United States had revealed a terrifying new power, the atomic bomb. It didn't stay alone for long. By 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its own nuclear bomb, shocking the West. The age of mutual nuclear fear had begun. Soon, both superpowers began a massive arms race, not just building more bombs, but bigger, faster, and deadlier ones. In 1952, the US developed the hydrogen bomb, a weapon 1,000 times more powerful than those dropped in 1945. The Soviets followed just a year later. By the 1960s, each side had thousands of nuclear warheads, enough to destroy the world many times over. Missiles were replaced on land, in submarines, and later in outer space. This led to a new strategy, mutually assured destruction, MAD. If one side launched, both would be annihilated. It was terrifying, but strangely, it kept the peace. Nations feared not just war, but the end of civilization. The world lived under the shadow of mushroom cloud, haunted by a war that might never be fought, but could end everything. Chapter 30. Proxy wars begin. Ideologies go global. Though the Second World War had ended, its ideology legacy continued to burn. The West, led by the United States, promoted democracy and capitalism. The East, led by the Soviet Union, spread communism. But neither side wanted to start another world war. So instead, they fought through others in proxy wars. The first major proxy conflict came in Korea, 1950-1953. After the Second World War, Korea had been divided at 38 parallel. The Soviets supported the North, and Americans supported the South. In 1950, North Korea invaded by the South. The United Nations, led by the US, responded with force. China joined the war on the side of the North. The result, 3 years of brutal war, millions of deaths, and a return to the same division. Then came Vietnam, Afghanistan, Congo, and many more. Each conflict looked local but had global fingerprints. In these proxy wars, superpowers provided weapons, training, and money. Local people paid the price in blood, destruction, and division. The Cold War was no longer cold. It burned through the jungles of Asia, the deserts in the Middle East, and the villages of Africa. Behind every battle, the shadow of the Second World War ideologies loomed large, still shaping the world long after the bombs stopped falling. Chapter 31. Vietnam, a war shaped by the Second World War. Before the Second World War, Vietnam was a French colony. During the war, Japan took control of the region, but allowed the French to remain as puppet administrators. When Japan was defeated in 1945, a power vacuum emerged. A Vietnamese independence movement led by Ho Chi Minh declared the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Ho had fought the Japanese, and he hoped the Allies would support Vietnam's independence, especially after the Atlantic Charter promised freedom for all nations. But France wanted its colony back, and the United States, now focused on stopping communism, supported the French. This led to the First Indochina War, 1946-1954, between French colonial forces and Vietnamese nationalists. In 1954, the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu. A peace agreement divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. North Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh, its communist side. South Vietnam, backed by the West, who known as anti-communist. Soon, a new war began, this time not against colonialism, but between Cold War ideologies. The Vietnam War, 1955-1975, became a symbol of the global Cold War. The US fought to stop communism from spreading. The Soviets and China supported the North. Millions of Vietnamese civilians were caught in the middle. The roots of this conflict ran deep back to the collapse of the empires after the Second World War and the promises of freedom that were not fulfilled. Chapter 32. The Middle East after the Second World War. Oil, borders, and conflict. The Second World War didn't just reshape Europe, it rewrote the balance of power in the Middle East. During the war, Britain and the Soviet Union had occupied Iran to secure oil and supply routes. After the war, both powers tried to maintain influence, but Iran pushed for independence, eventually leading to tensions with the West and the rise of nationalism. Meanwhile, the collapse of colonial empires left a vacuum across the region. In Palestine, tensions exploded after the horrors of the Holocaust. There was growing pressure to create a Jewish homeland. In 1947, the United Nations proposed splitting Palestine into two states, one Jewish, one Arab. In 1948, the State of Israel was declared. War broke out immediately with neighboring Arab states. This was the beginning of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which would flare repeatedly over the decades. At the same time, oil became more than just a resource. It became a weapon of global power. Western powers supported monarchies and regimes that could guarantee oil flow, while local populations grew resentful of foreign control throughout the region. Nationalism clashed with old imperial structures. The Cold War soon reached the Middle East too, with both the US and USSR backing different sides. The Second World War may have ended in 1945, but in the Middle East, it left behind fragile borders, bitter legacies, and battles still being fought today. Chapter 3: Decolonization, the Fall of Empires. Before the Second World War, much of the world was still ruled by European empires. Britain, France, and Netherlands, Belgium, and others controlled vast territories across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. But the war weakened the colonial powers. They had drained their resources, lost their moral high ground, and inspired resistance movements. In Asia, India led the way after decades of peaceful and violent struggle. Britain finally granted India independence in 1947, splitting it into India and Pakistan. In a bloody partition soon after, Indonesia fought Dutch colonial rule and won independence in 1949. In Africa, dozens of nations followed in the 1950s and the 1960s. Ghana, Kenya, Algeria, and many others. The idea of self-determination, promoted in the Atlantic Charter during the Second World War, became a global rallying cry. However, decolonization was rarely peaceful. In places like Algeria and Vietnam, the process led to brutal wars. Elsewhere, colonial powers granted independence, but often kept economic or political influence. The Cold War complicated everything. The US and USSR competed to sway these new nations, turning former colonies into the new battlegrounds. Still, the message was clear. The world of empires was dying, and the age of nations, born from the ashes of the Second World War, had begun. Chapter 34: The Rise of China after the Second World War. During the Second World War, China was invaded by Japan. Despite internal tensions, both the nationalists and the communists fought the Japanese, though uneasily and not always together. When Japan surrendered in 1945, China was left devastated, and the real war was just beginning. Almost immediately, civil war resumed between the Nationalist Party, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong. The US supported the nationalists. The Soviets gave limited support to the communists, but most of Mao's power came from rural peasant support by guerrilla tactics developed by the Second World War. By 1949, the communists had defeated the nationalists who fled to Taiwan. On October 1st, 1949, Mao declared the founding of the People's Republic of China. The West was stunned. The world's most populous nation had become communist, a huge shift in the Cold War balance. China's rise added a third major force to the post-war world. The US led West Union and now Red China. This would shape the conflicts to come in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. China would play its own game, at times cooperating with the USSR and later rivaling it. The Second World War had given China strength, unity, and experience, and now it was stepping onto the world stage as a revolutionary power. Chapter 35: The Korean War, the Forgotten Battlefield. At the end of the Second World War, Korea was liberated from the Japanese rule, but it didn't become free. It became divided. The Allies had agreed to split Korea at the 38th parallel. The Soviet Union controlled the North. The United States oversaw the South. Each side installed friendly governments. Communist North Korea, led by Kim Il-sung. Anti-communist South Korea, led by Syngman Rhee. In June 1950, North Korea invaded the South, hoping to unify the country by force. The United Nations, led by the US, quickly intervened. American and South Korean forces pushed the North back, nearly to the Chinese border. Then China entered the war, sending hundreds of thousands of troops. The tide turned. A brutal back and forth began. For 3 years, both sides fought fiercely. Villages were destroyed, civilians massacred, soldiers frozen in snow-covered trenches. By 1953, a ceasefire was signed, but no peace treaty. The border remained at the 38th parallel. Millions had died for a war that ended where it started. Korean War is often called the Forgotten War, but it was the first hot war of the Cold War and set the tone for conflicts to come. Chapter 26: Post-War Europe, Rebuilding a Broken Continent. In 1945, Europe was in ruins. Cities like Warsaw, Berlin, and Dresden had been reduced to rubble. Tens of millions were dead. Millions more were displaced, homeless, and starving. Infrastructure was destroyed. Economies had collapsed. Even basic survival was uncertain. But from the ashes, Europe began to rebuild. In the West, the United States launched a Marshall Plan, a massive aid package to help rebuild war-torn economies. Over 13 billion was sent to the Western European nations, reviving industries and boosting hope. Germany, once the enemy, became central to recovery. West Germany was rebuilt with American help and soon became a major economy. East Germany, under Soviet control, followed the communist path, slower and more restricted. France, Italy, and Netherlands, and others, saw economic growth return in 1950s. The horrors of war pushed nations to seek unity, not conflict. In 1951, 6 countries created the European Coal and Steel Community, a small but powerful step toward cooperation. This would later evolve into the European Union. But rebuilding wasn't just economic. Europe had to confront its guilt, trauma, and division. Memories of genocide, collaboration, and destruction would shape politics for generations. The war had shattered Europe, but it also forced it to imagine something new, peace through unity. Chapter 37: Post-War Japan, From Defeat to Economic Miracle. In 1945, Japan surrendered unconditionally. Two atomic bombs had devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Cities were reduced to ashes. The economy collapsed, and the emperor's divine status was gone. For the first time in history, Japan was occupied by a foreign force. Led by U.S. General Douglas MacArthur, the Allied occupation aimed to disarm Japan completely, democratize the political system, rebuild the economy. A new constitution was enacted in 1947, turning Japan into a parliamentary democracy. Article 9 of the Constitution declared that Japan would never again wage war. Instead of focusing on military power, Japan poured its energy into economic development. American aid and access to global markets helped, but so did Japanese innovation, discipline, and education. By the 1950s, factories that once built tanks were producing radios, cameras, and cars. By the 1960s and 70s, brands like Sony, Toyota, and Honda became global names. Japan's transformation was called an economic miracle. From devastation to prosperity in less than 30 years. But beneath the surface were memories of trauma. Generation grew up with war scars, pacifist values, and a new identity. One of that rejected imperialism and embraced stability. The Second World War had ended Japan's empire, but it also gave birth to a new Japan, more powerful in peace than it ever was in war. Chapter 38: War Crimes, Memory, and Justice. The Second World War was not just the most destructive conflict in history, it also revealed the deepest horrors of human behavior: the Holocaust, the rape of Nanjing, medical experiments, mass bombings. Millions of civilians died in systematic, industrialized violence. After the war, the world demanded justice. In 1945, the Allied powers held the Nuremberg trials in Germany. For the first time, leaders of a defeated nation were tried for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. 12 top Nazis were sentenced to death. Others faced prison. But the trials also established a precedent. Political leaders can be held accountable under international law. In Asia, the Tokyo trials prosecuted Japanese officials for war atrocities, including massacres, forced labors, and torture of the POWs. However, not all crimes were punished. Some guilty individuals escaped justice, and some nations, including the visitors, avoided full responsibility for their own actions. Still, these trials planted the seeds for the Geneva Conventions 1949, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and eventually, the International Criminal Court. But justice is not just legal, it's also historical and moral. Countries like Germany deeply confronted their past through education and memorials. Others, like Japan, faced internal struggles over how to remember or forget. Today, the legacy of the Second World War crimes still shapes politics, identity, and trust between nations. The war ended in 1945, but the fight for truth, memory, and accountability is still ongoing. So I think that is the end of our stories today. Thank you for your listen. Please subscribe our channel and support our content by leave your comment below. Thank you. You have a good night.